This is a headstone. This is it here, in situ, but in situ it's turned face down. This is the front of it. This is the top, this is the bottom. There was never any writing on it. This is paint. This is the original paint of it. But again, it's carved out of solid limestone, locally made, but it is copying, it is mimicking European style headstones that would have been made out of wood, marble, or some more expensive material other than local limestone. Even for the local limestone, this was going to be a push. You needed a professional stonemason to do that. Now, these two images below here, these speak to what happened to the cemetery by the early 20th century. In the 1920s, Nassau was devastated by two hurricanes in 1926 and 1929. We know from Center Burial Ground and some archival records that in areas like East Bay Street that were on the waterfront, they were inundated. The storm surge pushed sand into Center Burial Ground. We had to do some emergency excavations in there when they were putting in the wall and damaged some of the graves, and you would find just a layer of finely crushed shell. That's an indicator that that shell came in on the storm surge. Center Burial Ground has above ground recognizable tombs with legible writings on them. This one had above ground tombs, but none of them were being written on. It seems after the area was devastated by the hurricane, the government was so overwhelmed in cleanup for that hurricane. They cleaned up the road and other areas they felt they absolutely had to. Everything else was just left to go the way of the world, including this cemetery. Its formal name originally was St. Matthew's Northern Burial Ground for Blacks and People of Color. And by the 1830s, Governor Colburn advised all of the priests that he no longer wanted to see people segregated in death as they were in life, so he authorized Anglican ministers to no longer use racial markers for cemeteries. So from about 1836 onward, you find the for blacks and people of color dropped, and this became simply St. Matthew's Northern Burial Ground, or simply Northern Burial Ground. But by the time you come up to the early 1900s, it had apparently been closed by then. And with the devastation of those hurricanes, the government is figuring, and it's not, my sentiment is, it's probably not simply because it was a cemetery originally for poor black people, because I always use the example of Christ Church Cemetery. That was destroyed too. But it seems the general attitude is, you dead, you out of sight, you out of mind, unless you have descendants or people who still care or are aware to make a fuss about it. Sometime in the 1930s or 1940s, a sidewalk was put through this site. Now, I'm telling you all of this because these burials here, these are original burials. They are less than a meter below the current grave surface. When they were putting in the sidewalk, to put in the sidewalk, you need to dig a bit to get the bedding for that. This is the largest cache of skeletal remains I found in the cemetery site. This is the cranium. This is most of the cranium, and cradling below it, you'll see a bit here. There were most of the ribs, most of the spine. I suspect this was a female because of some cultural material I found, but all of the markers on this cranium that would indicate the gender of this individual, like the brow lines, the jaw lines, all of those markers are gone on this cranium. So it becomes difficult to determine whether this was a male or female. You just know it was an adult. But you see this layer of fine rocks here, and this is the bed of the original sidewalk that went in. This is about 2 to 3 inches below that. I'm figuring they had to dig to lay this bed. They were coming across all of these burials. They were digging them up, piling them up, and dumping them. But it seems they were falling behind time. That was taking too much time, so they got kind of lazy in spots with these skeletal remains and with this stone. This headstone was simply pushed over because here, this again is the bed for the earliest version of the sidewalk. It's literally a few inches below that. This was simply pushed forward and covered up. These ones were slightly lower because the area is narrow, but it has a slight slope. This was the only in situ portion of a burial I found. There was some foot bones associated with this, but my other challenge was, this is water. I wasn't, even though I knew this was near the water's edge, I didn't have a pump. I didn't have the equipment to deal with this and to clear things out. But all of these materials, this one was taken out. This is in the lab. These were left in place. But all of these materials, because this was originally near the water's edge, this is salt water, so all of these materials taken out of this site were soaked in fresh water to leach the salt out eventually. But this cemetery went through major devastation in the early 20th century. Okay, so now this cemetery, more so than Bethlehem, is showing several features of African cultural traditions for burials. Bethlehem is notable because the trees are still there. Several of them are still there in association with graves. For Northern Burial Ground, I still haven't been able to find a botanist who can help me with that because it's more difficult to estimate the age of tropical hardwoods because our rainy season is so unpredictable. But this site had several features. For African burials, and it changes slightly when you come to the Americas, it was common in West Africa to put personal dishes of the individual on top of the grave. All of the references I could find for West Africa talks about that being done for a chief, an important person. When you come to the Americas, you find that that is being done for everybody. My hypothesis on that is that in the Americas, because they are at the bottom of the social ladder, even if they were free people generally, and they are so socially disadvantaged, it was culturally important for their community, for their personal worldview to build their self-esteem. So it became extremely important that you treat everyone like an important individual. You treat everyone like a chief, put their things on top of the grave. Because what that does, it gives you an indication of who that individual is. Because these African societies are not literate societies, so they're not going to leave gravestones with the fancy little details telling you in words who this person was. They have to do that with other cultural material. So this here, now these materials here, especially these two, told me that this cemetery was in use long before the Loyalist period. This cemetery, from this kind of cultural material, I was able to conclude that this cemetery was earlier than Bethlehem Cemetery. This cemetery is contemporary with Center Burial Ground across the street. That is probably why it was across the street. No one made these black people go across the street. They chose a site across the street because they wanted to do some things in their burial area that they would not have been able to do in Center Burial Ground. They wanted to be as close to the water as possible. They wanted to leave their things on top of the grave. They wanted to be able to plant trees or plants at the head of the grave. In Center Burial Ground, the priest was going to have something to say about that. So they did their own thing. Now, I know that from these two, because of their manufacturing time period, this type ceramic, this is white glazed stoneware. It's an English type stoneware. The Europeans, ever since the early 1600s, Europeans were fascinated by Chinese porcelain and were trying to copy it. They never did manage to do that for almost 200 years, but this is one of the earliest, most successful examples that English people got to. It has a distinctive look on them, but this is the patterning. This patterning would have been done by Josiah Wedgwood. He was cutting edge in terms of experimenting with and marketing ceramics. This goes out of style about the 1760s, 1780s. So unless someone in the Loyalist period brought this with them, it would have been a dish about 20 years old. That's still feasible, but more than likely it's earlier. Another thing that added, this is a part of a ceramic bottle, a stoneware bottle. And there's only this, but this is the edge of a stamp here. These two fragments were all that I found of the bottle. I couldn't find any examples of this in any published books. I was in Williamsburg. William and Mary, the College of William and Mary is literally across the street from Colonial Williamsburg. And if you're a PhD archaeology student, you have access to the archaeological collection for Colonial Williamsburg. They have the largest collection for the English-speaking Americas in this hemisphere. One of these was on display in the Amy Aldrich Rockefeller Museum of Cultural Material. This is a mineral water bottle. It would have been German. This was expensive. This is like buying Perrier water today. But this is a water bottle. And I like to explain to people, this is the only ceramic bottle I found, but there were some glass bottles. Bottles back then would have been constantly reused and recycled. I don't know about y'all, but my Dasani water bottle, I use them for months before I throw them away. I don't just use it once and drink out water, throw it away.
Something I stumbled across. It's very interesting. The Lynn and Harry Bradley Foundation conducted a research in 2007 to determine what Americans consider to be their national identity. Interestingly, Americans considered their national identity as a commitment to freedom.